As the raiders fled in the face of the human warriors' onslaught, the colonists of Epsilon 7 could scarcely believe their eyes. The sheer power and brutality displayed by this mysterious figure had been nothing short of awe-inspiring, and for some, deeply unsettling. Jack, in particular, found himself grappling with a mix of emotions as he watched the human stride back towards the spacecraft. Relief and gratitude warred with a growing sense of unease, for the way the warrior had dispatched the raiders was unlike anything he had ever witnessed. It was as if the human was a force of nature, a living embodiment of pure destruction, their every move calculated and executed with a cold, clinical precision that bordered on the inhuman. As the spacecraft's engines roared to life, the colonists emerged from their hiding places, their eyes fixed on the departing vessel. Some whispered words of thanks, while others simply stared, their faces etched with a mixture of wonder and trepidation. Jack, however, found himself unable to look away, his mind racing with questions. Who was this human, and where had they come from? What kind of training or experiences had forged them into such a formidable warrior? And most importantly, would they ever see them again? In the eerie silence that followed the battle, the young communications officer slowly made his way through the devastated streets, his gaze sweeping over the scene of carnage. Broken weapons, shattered buildings, and the lifeless bodies of the raiders. The signs of the humans' deadly intervention were everywhere, a stark reminder of the sheer power they had wielded. As Jack reached the front lines of the battle, he paused, his eyes drawn to a peculiar sight. Amidst the debris and destruction, he spotted the human's discarded weapon, a sleek, compact device that had clearly been the source of those devastating energy beams. Hesitantly, Jack reached down and picked it up, his fingers tracing the smooth contours of the device. It was unlike anything he had ever seen, both elegant and deadly in its design. For a moment, he entertained the thought of studying it, of trying to understand the technology that had made the human such a formidable warrior. But then he quickly shook his head, a shiver of unease running down his spine. No, he couldn't keep this. It wasn't his to have. This was a weapon of the Deathworlder, and the very thought of it in the hands of the colonists sent a wave of apprehension through him. Carefully, Jack placed the device back on the ground, taking a step back, as if it might suddenly come to life and strike him down. He knew, deep down, that this was not something they should tamper with, not something they could ever hope to control. As the young man rejoined the other colonists, he found them gathered in small groups, their voices hushed as they discussed the events of the past few hours. Some were already speculating about the identity of the human warrior, while others voiced concerns about the potential threat they might pose. Jack listened in silence, his own thoughts echoing their unease. For in the wake of the Deathworlder's devastating display of power, the once peaceful colony of Epsilon 7 had been forever changed. The sense of security and tranquility that had once permeated the settlement had been shattered, replaced by a growing sense of uncertainty and even fear. And as Jack gazed up at the night sky, watching the distant speck of the departing spacecraft, he couldn't help but wonder if this was just the beginning, the first harbinger of a storm that would forever alter the course of their lives. As the mysterious figure emerged from the spacecraft, the colonists of Epsilon 7 found themselves torn between hope and trepidation. Were they about to be saved, or had they unwittingly summoned an even greater threat? The warriors' movements were swift and purposeful, their heavy boots crunching against the debris-strewn ground as they advanced towards the battle. Jack, still clutching his makeshift weapon, watched with bated breath, his mind racing with questions. Who was this heavily armored individual? Were they friend or foe? And where was the galactic patrol that had promised to come to their aid? The raiders, too, seemed unsure of how to react. They had been caught off guard by the unexpected arrival of the spacecraft, and now they found themselves faced with this singular, imposing figure whose very presence seemed to radiate a palpable sense of danger. Sensing an opportunity, the colonists quickly regrouped, their spirits buoyed by the arrival of this mysterious warrior. Perhaps, they dared to hope, This was the reinforcement they had been praying for. As the human drew closer, Jack's eyes widened in awe and trepidation. The figure's armor was unlike anything he had ever seen, sleek, streamlined, and seemingly impervious to the raiders' weapons. And the way they moved, with such fluid grace and absolute confidence, spoke of a level of training and experience that far surpassed that of the average soldier. When the human finally reached the front lines of the battle, they paused for a moment, surveying the scene with a cold, calculating gaze. Then, without a word, they raised their arm, and a brilliant beam of energy erupted from a device mounted on their wrist, lancing out with blinding speed and precision. The first raider fell, their weapon clattering to the ground as they crumpled, stunned by the sheer power of the human's attack. The other raiders, momentarily paralyzed by the display of raw might, hesitated for a crucial moment. And that was all the opening the human needed. In a blur of motion, the warrior began to systematically dismantle the raiders' forces, their attacks swift and merciless. Beams of energy, fired with unerring accuracy, felled one raider after another, while the human's free hand wielded a wickedly sharp blade that carved through armor and flesh with equal ease. The colonists watched in awestruck silence, their hearts racing as they bore witness to this display of unparalleled combat prowess. Jack, in particular, found himself torn between a growing sense of gratitude and an unsettling unease. This was no galactic patrol officer. This was a force of nature, a living embodiment of raw, unbridled power. As the battle raged on, the raiders' numbers dwindled, their morale crumbling in the face of the humans' relentless onslaught. Realizing that retreat was their only option, the remaining invaders turned and fled, their cries of panic and terror echoing through the devastated streets. The human paused, their chest rising and falling with the exertion of the fight, their gaze sweeping across the battered colony. For a brief moment, their eyes met Jack's, and the young communications officer felt a shiver run down his spine, unable to discern the emotions, if any, hidden behind that impassive mask. Then, without a word, the warrior turned and began to make their way back towards the spacecraft, their steps heavy but purposeful. Jack watched, his heart pounding, as the human boarded the vessel and the engines roared to life, the spacecraft quickly disappearing into the night sky. In the eerie silence that followed, the colonists slowly emerged from their hiding places, their expressions a mixture of relief, awe, and trepidation. They had been saved, but at what cost? And who, or what, was this enigmatic figure who had come to their rescue? As Jack surveyed the aftermath of the battle, he couldn't help but wonder if the worst was yet to come. For in the wake of the humans' departure, a new sense of unease had settled over the colony, like the calm before an even greater storm. As the raiders fled in the face of the human warriors' onslaught, the colonists of Epsilon 7 could scarcely believe their eyes. The sheer power and brutality displayed by this mysterious figure had been nothing short of awe-inspiring, and for some, deeply unsettling. Jack, in particular, found himself grappling with a mix of emotions as he watched the human stride back towards the spacecraft. Relief and gratitude warred with a growing sense of unease, for the way the warrior had dispatched the raiders was unlike anything he had ever witnessed. It was as if the human was a force of nature, a living embodiment of pure destruction, their every move calculated and executed with a cold, clinical precision that bordered on the inhuman. As the spacecraft's engines roared to life, the colonists emerged from their hiding places, their eyes fixed on the departing vessel. Some whispered words of thanks, while others simply stared, their faces etched with a mixture of wonder and trepidation. Jack, however, found himself unable to look away, his mind racing with questions. Who was this human, and where had they come from? What kind of training or experiences had forged them into such a formidable warrior? And most importantly, would they ever see them again? In the eerie silence that followed the battle, the young communications officer slowly made his way through the devastated streets, his gaze sweeping over the scene of carnage. Broken weapons, shattered buildings, and the lifeless bodies of the raiders. The signs of the humans' deadly intervention were everywhere, a stark reminder of the sheer power they had wielded. As Jack reached the front lines of the battle, he paused, his eyes drawn to a peculiar sight. Amidst the debris and destruction, he spotted the humans' discarded weapon, a sleek, compact device that had clearly been the source of those devastating energy beams. Hesitantly, Jack reached down and picked it up, his fingers tracing the smooth contours of the device. It was unlike anything he had ever seen, both elegant and deadly in its design. For a moment, he entertained the thought of studying it, of trying to understand the technology that had made the human such a formidable warrior. But then he quickly shook his head, a shiver of unease running down his spine. No, he couldn't keep this. It wasn't his to have. This was a weapon of the Deathworlder, and the very thought of it in the hands of the colonists sent a wave of apprehension through him. Carefully, Jack placed the device back on the ground, taking a step back as if it might suddenly come to life and strike him down. He knew, deep down, that this was not something they should tamper with, not something they could ever hope to control. As the young man rejoined the other colonists, he found them gathered in small groups, their voices hushed as they discussed the events of the past few hours. Some were already speculating about the identity of the human warrior, while others voiced concerns about the potential threat they might pose. Jack listened in silence, his own thoughts echoing their unease, for in the wake of the Deathworlder's devastating display of power, the once peaceful colony of Epsilon 7 had been forever changed. The sense of security and tranquility that had once permeated the settlement had been shattered, replaced by a growing sense of uncertainty and even fear. And as Jack gazed up at the night sky, watching the distant speck of the departing spacecraft, he couldn't help but wonder if this was just the beginning, the first harbinger of a storm that would forever alter the course of their lives. As the days passed following the Deathworlder's dramatic intervention, the colony of Epsilon 7 found itself in a state of uneasy calm. The raiders had not returned, and the immediate threat to their settlement had been neutralized, but the lingering presence of the human warrior's destruction weighed heavily on the minds of the colonists. Jack, in particular, found himself unable to shake the memory of the Deathworlder's ruthless efficiency in battle. The way they had effortlessly dispatched the raiders, their movements so fluid and calculated, had left an indelible mark on the young communications officer's psyche. He had watched, transfixed, as the human had unleashed such raw, unbridled power that had quite literally turned the tide of the battle and saved their colony from certain ruin. And yet, the very thought of that power in the hands of someone, or something, so utterly foreign and mysterious filled Jack with a sense of profound unease. As the colonists began the arduous process of rebuilding their shattered homes and lives, Jack found himself drawn to the sight of the Deathworlder's departure, his gaze fixed on the scorched earth and the lingering traces of the spacecraft's thrusters. He wasn't alone in his curiosity and apprehension. The other colonists, too, would occasionally venture to the outskirts of the settlement, their eyes scanning the horizon as if they half expected the human warrior to suddenly reappear. But the Deathworlder remained elusive, their departure as enigmatic as their arrival. Days turned into weeks, and still, the colony saw no sign of the mysterious figure, leaving the colonists to grapple with a growing sense of uncertainty and even a hint of disappointment. Had the Deathworlder truly been their savior, or merely a harbinger of even greater peril to come? The question swirled in Jack's mind, fueled by a nagging sense of doubt that refused to be silenced. One day, as the young communications officer was overseeing the reconstruction efforts, he was approached by the colony's elder, a wise and respected member of the community. The old man's eyes were filled with a mixture of gratitude and trepidation, and Jack knew instantly that the topic of conversation would be the Deathworlder. "Jack," the elder began, his voice low and measured, "I've been thinking a lot about what happened here, and I can't help but wonder, was that human truly our salvation, or something much more sinister?" Jack felt a twinge of unease as the elder spoke, his own doubts and concerns surfacing once more. "I don't know, Elder," he replied, his brow furrowing. "They saved us. That much is certain. But the way they fought, the sheer power they wielded, it unsettles me too." The Elder nodded solemnly, his gaze drifting towards the horizon. "I fear that we may have invited something into our lives that we cannot hope to control," he said, his words tinged with a sense of foreboding. "That human, that Deathworlder, as they've been called, they are not like us, Jack. They are a force of nature, a harbinger of chaos and destruction." Jack felt a chill run down his spine at the Elder's words, his own doubts and misgivings suddenly crystallizing into a tangible sense of dread. "What should we do, then?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The Elder turned to him, his eyes reflecting the weight of the decision they now faced. "We must be vigilant, Jack," he said, his tone grave. "We must prepare ourselves, for if the Deathworlder returns, we may find ourselves facing a storm that we cannot hope to weather." With that, the Elder turned and walked away, leaving Jack alone with his thoughts, his heart heavy with the realization that their colony's future hung in the balance, forever altered by the arrival of the enigmatic and terrifying warrior they had called upon for aid. As the weeks passed, the colony of Epsilon 7 slowly began to rebuild, the scars of the Raider attack slowly fading from the landscape. But the shadow of the Deathworlder's arrival lingered, a constant presence in the minds of the colonists. Jack, in particular, found himself increasingly drawn to the mysteries that surrounded the enigmatic warrior. He had replayed the events of that fateful night over and over in his mind, mesmerized by the human's sheer power and efficiency in battle. What kind of experiences, what kind of training, had forged such a formidable fighter? And more importantly, what burden did the Deathworlder carry that had etched such a haunted expression in their eyes? Driven by his curiosity, Jack began to quietly investigate, speaking with the older members of the colony and scouring the archives for any information that might shed light on the nature of the Deathworlder. But his efforts yielded little, as the human remained a mystery shrouded in a veil of secrecy and uncertainty. One day, as Jack was poring over the colony's records, the Elder approached him, a troubled expression on his weathered face. "Jack, I've been watching you," the old man said, his voice low and grave. "I know you've been trying to learn more about the Deathworlder, but I must caution you, some things are better left unknown." Jack looked up, his brow furrowed in concern. "Elder, I just want to understand," he said, his voice tinged with a note of desperation. "What is it about this human that has everyone so unsettled? Surely they can't be as dangerous as we fear." The Elder sighed, his gaze drifting towards the horizon. "You've seen the Deathworlder's power, Jack," he said, his words measured and deliberate. "You've seen the destruction they can unleash. But what you haven't seen are the scars they carry, the horrors they've witnessed." Jack felt a chill run down his spine as the Elder spoke, a newfound sense of empathy beginning to take root within him. "Scars?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What do you mean?" The Elder turned to him, his eyes reflecting the weight of a lifetime's worth of experience. "The Deathworlder is not like us, Jack," he said, his tone heavy with something akin to sorrow. "They have seen the very worst of what this galaxy has to offer, have been forged in the crucible of war and conflict. The power they wield is not a gift, but a burden, one that has cost them dearly." Jack felt his breath catch in his throat as the Elder's words sank in. He had been so focused on the Deathworlder's sheer power, so caught up in the terror of their destructive capabilities, that he had never once stopped to consider the cost to the human themselves. "What happened to them?" he asked, his voice trembling. The Elder shook his head slowly. "I do not know the details, and I suspect the Deathworlder would not share them even if I did," he said. "But I can see the pain in their eyes, the weight of their experiences. They are a warrior, yes, but also a survivor, one who has borne witness to things that none of us can imagine." Jack felt a lump forming in his throat as he imagined the horrors the Deathworlder must have endured, the trauma They must have suffered. Suddenly, the humans' aloof, distant demeanor made perfect sense. They were not merely a fearsome warrior, but a soul scarred by the very violence they had been forced to wield. "We must be prepared, Jack," the elder said, his voice grave. "But we must also remember that the Deathworlder is not our enemy. They are a protector, a guardian, but also a reminder of the darkness that lurks in the depths of our galaxy. And if they ever return, we must be ready to offer them not just our gratitude, but our understanding and our support." Jack nodded, his resolve hardening as he realized the true weight of the responsibility they now carried. For in the Deathworlder, they had found not just a savior, but a kindred spirit, one whose burden was as heavy as their power was mighty. As the weeks turned into months, the colony of Epsilon 7 settled into a cautious routine, their wary eyes always scanning the horizon for any sign of the Deathworlder's return. The memory of their unexpected savior's arrival had become a constant presence in the minds of the colonists, a mixture of gratitude and trepidation that refused to be silenced. For Jack, the young communications officer, the weight of the Deathworlder's legacy had become increasingly difficult to bear. On one hand, he could not deny the sheer power and skill that the human warrior had displayed in driving off the raiders and saving their settlement. But on the other, the nagging sense of unease that had taken root within him only seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. The elder's words had resonated deeply with Jack, opening his eyes to the true burden that the Deathworlder carried. The scars of a lifetime spent in the crucible of war and conflict. He had come to see the human not just as a fearsome fighter, but as a survivor, a guardian whose power was as much a curse as it was a blessing. And yet, as Jack pondered the implications of the Deathworlder's presence, he couldn't help but wonder if the rest of the colony shared his more nuanced perspective. For among his fellow colonists, the reactions to the human warrior's intervention ranged from awe and reverence to outright fear and mistrust. Some, like the elder, saw the Deathworlder as a necessary protector, a force to be respected and perhaps even embraced. They argued that the human's power was not something to be feared, but rather a tool to be harnessed in the defense of their community. Others, however, were not so easily convinced. They pointed to the sheer brutality of the Deathworlder's assault on the raiders, the way the human had dispatched their foes with such ruthless efficiency, and they questioned whether such a force could ever truly be controlled or trusted. The debates raged on, fueled by the colonists' growing sense of vulnerability and the lingering uncertainty of the Deathworlder's ultimate intentions. And as the days passed, Jack found himself caught in the middle, torn between his own growing empathy for the human warrior and the nagging doubts that continued to plague him. One day, as Jack was tending to his duties in the communications center, the elder approached him, a troubled expression etched upon his weathered features. "Jack," the old man said, his voice low and grave, "I've been speaking with the others, and I'm afraid we're at an impasse. Some of the colonists are adamant that we should try to make contact with the Deathworlder, to forge an alliance and enlist their aid in protecting our settlement." Jack felt a chill run down his spine at the elder's words, his mind racing with the implications. "And the others?" he asked, already dreading the answer. "They believe that the Deathworlder is too dangerous, too unpredictable to be trusted," the elder replied, his eyes reflecting the weight of the decision they now faced. "They're convinced that if we try to bring the human back, we'll be inviting even greater peril into our lives." Jack nodded slowly, his own doubts and fears rising to the surface once more. He could understand both sides of the argument, the desire to harness the Deathworlder's power for their own protection, and the equally valid concern that such a force could not be controlled. "What do you think we should do, Elder?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The elder sighed, his gaze drifting towards the horizon. "I wish I knew, Jack," he said, his words heavy with a sense of resignation. "All I know is that we stand at a crossroads, and the choice we make will have lasting consequences for our entire community." As the elder walked away, Jack found himself lost in a whirlwind of emotions, his mind grappling with the impossible decision that now lay before them. For in the wake of the Deathworlder's arrival, the once peaceful colony of Epsilon 7 had been forever changed, and the future they had once envisioned now hung in the balance, precariously balanced on the edge of an abyss. As the colony of Epsilon 7 grappled with the decision of whether to reach out to the Deathworlder, the days ticked by in a tense, uneasy silence. Jack found himself caught in the center of the debate, his own doubts and misgivings warring with a growing sense of empathy and understanding for the mysterious human warrior. In the end, the colony's elders convened a meeting, their faces etched with the weight of the decision they had made. Jack, along with the rest of the community, gathered in the town square, their eyes fixed on the elders as they addressed the gathered crowd. "My fellow colonists," the elder began, his voice heavy with gravity, "we have deliberated long and hard on the matter of the Deathworlder, and after much consideration, we have reached a decision." Jack felt his heart race as the elder spoke, his mind racing with the possibilities of what that decision might be. Would they reach out to the Deathworlder, seeking an alliance and their continued protection? Or would they choose to cut all ties, determined to forge their own path without the burden of the human warrior's presence? "It is our belief," the elder continued, "that the Deathworlder is not someone we can truly control or predict. Their power is a double-edged sword, a force that has the potential to both save us and destroy us in equal measure." The crowd murmured in response, a mixture of agreement and dissent rippling through the gathered colonists. Jack remained silent, his gaze fixed on the elder, his own doubts and fears mirrored in the old man's weathered features. "And so," the elder said, raising a hand to quiet the crowd, "we have decided that it would be best for our colony if we did not seek out the Deathworlder's aid. We must learn to stand on our own, to forge our own path without the looming shadow of this enigmatic warrior." A collective gasp went up from the crowd, and Jack felt a wave of conflicting emotions wash over him. Part of him understood the elder's reasoning, the desire to assert their independence and avoid the potential risks of the Deathworlder's return. But another part of him, the part that had come to see the human warrior not just as a savior, but as a kindred spirit, felt a pang of sorrow at the thought of severing all ties. As the meeting adjourned and the colonists began to disperse, Jack found himself drawn once more to the site of the Deathworlder's departure. He stood there, alone, his gaze fixed on the horizon, his heart heavy with a mixture of gratitude and regret. And then, as if summoned by his very thoughts, a familiar shape appeared in the distance, a sleek, powerful spacecraft descending from the sky. Jack felt a surge of anticipation, his breath catching in his throat as the vessel touched down, the hatch opening to reveal the imposing figure of the Deathworlder. The human warrior strode forward, their movements measured and purposeful, their gaze sweeping across the colony with a stoic expression. And as their eyes met Jack's, the young communications officer felt a shiver run down his spine, 1,000 unspoken emotions reflected in that brief, fleeting moment of connection. Without a word, the Deathworlder turned and began to board the spacecraft, their heavy boots crunching against the scorched earth. Jack watched, transfixed, as the human warrior paused at the threshold, their head turning slightly as if to catch one last glimpse of the colony. And in that instant, Jack swore he saw a flicker of something in the Deathworlder's eyes, a hint of sadness, perhaps, or a longing for a life they had once known. But the moment passed as quickly as it had come, and the human warrior disappeared into the spacecraft, the engines roaring to life as the vessel quickly vanished into the night sky. Jack stood there, alone, his heart heavy with a bittersweet mixture of gratitude and regret. For in the wake of the Deathworlder's departure, the once peaceful colony of Epsilon 7 had been forever changed, their future forever intertwined with the legacy of this enigmatic and formidable warrior.